This move, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, aiming to control key squares and prepare for rapid development. This move signals an intention to enter a flexible Indian defense, aiming to control the center from a distance and prepare for later pawn breaks. This move establishes central pawn control and prepares to challenge Black's knight, aiming to initiate a standard queen's pawn opening structure with classical development. This move signals a transition into a queen's Indian defense or possibly a Nimzo Indian, preparing to develop the dark squared bishop to a more active square rather than blocking it behind the e-pawn as in the king's Indian. This move develops a knight to a natural central square, supporting the pawn on d4 and preparing for further queenside development or a central pawn push. Developing the bishop to b4 creates an immediate pin on the knight, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially gain an advantage by forcing material concessions or positional weaknesses. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the kingside bishop, aiming for a solid queen's gambit declined structure with a clear development plan. Developing the king to safety is a fundamental principle, and castling now prepares for active play and solidifies the pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a natural square where it supports the e4 push and eyes the kingside, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while also potentially preparing to fianchetto the other bishop. This move initiates a pawn thrust to challenge White's central control and potentially open lines for Black's pieces, reflecting common strategies in the queen's gambit declined or Catalan setups. This move develops the knight to its natural square, preparing to castle and reinforcing the central pawn structure while keeping options open for a Catalan or queen's gambit declined variation. This move challenges White's central pawn structure and opens lines, aiming to achieve dynamic play characteristic of the queen's Indian defense, potentially leading to an isolated queen's pawn structure for White if the central pawns are exchanged. Castling on the kingside is a standard defensive maneuver that tucks the king away and activates a rook, preparing for the complex positional struggles ahead in this queen's gambit declined structure. This pawn capture enters the main line of the queen's Indian defense, initiating a strategic battle for central control and piece activity. This recapture restores material balance and opens the c-file for potential activity, while also developing the bishop to an active square. Developing the knight to d7 supports the advance of the c-pawn and prepares for a potential exchange of pieces on c4, simplifying the position while maintaining central control. This move, knight to e2, is a flexible repositioning, preparing to either support a central pawn push with f3 or to join the kingside attack via ing3, while also keeping the d4 pawn defended. This capture strategically opens the c-file for Black's rook and creates a more balanced pawn structure, preparing to challenge White's central control. This recaptures the pawn on d4, centralizing the knight and preparing to develop the kingside pieces further, aiming for active piece play within the solid queen's gambit declined structure. Developing the queen to e7 connects the rooks and prepares to contest the e-file, a common plan in this queen's Indian structure. This move prepares to gain space on the queenside and potentially challenge Black's bishop on b4. Developing the bishop to d6 supports the central pawn advance and prepares for potential piece activity on the queenside or kingside. This knight maneuver aggressively targets the c7 pawn, forcing Black to decide between defending it or accepting a pawn loss and potential queen activity. Disruption. The bishop retreats to b8 to avoid the knight's current outpost on b5. simultaneously preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal later in the game. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to support a potential queenside pawn advance or to reroute the knight to c4 if the opportunity arises. This move challenges white's knight, aiming to disrupt its outpost and potentially gain space on the queenside while freeing the bishop. On d6, this move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside pawns and supporting potential central expansion. The knight repositions to a more active square, challenging white's bishop and preparing to support a central pawn push or potentially swing to the kingside. White repositions the knight to c3, aiming to recapture the pawn on d5 should black advance their c-pawn again, while also preparing to potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square later in the game. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially prepare for b5 to expand on the queenside. This move activates the queen to potentially pressure black's queenside and prepares for central expansion by supporting the d4 pawn. The rook now claims the open c-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside. This move prepares to challenge black's knight on circa 5, aiming to improve white's piece activity by forcing exchanges or dislodging the knight from its strong central post. This move retreats the bishop to a more passive square, potentially allowing white to gain central space and pressure on the queenside. This move initiates a direct attack on black's kingside, aiming to exploit the open diagonal and pressure the f6 knight. This move, bc6, challenges white's aggressive queen on h4 and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, aiming to resolve the tension and gain space. This knight move is a powerful centralizing maneuver, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a pawn push to f4, while also preparing to redeploy to a more active square like g4 or f3. This retreat of the bishop to e8 offers a valuable retreat square and supports the pawn structure, while also preparing to challenge the advanced white knight if it ventures to g6. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support a potential kingside attack and improve piece coordination. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the g3 pawn and preparing to potentially support a kingside attack or defend along the c-file. nc4 repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak f7 pawn and preparing to support an eventual attack on the black kingside while challenging the bishop on a7. The rook on d8 activates onto the open file, connecting the rooks and preparing to contest the d-file, which is a crucial open line for both sides. This move proactively restricts black's queenside play, preparing to either expand on the queenside with b4 or support a potential kingside attack by preventing the knight or bishop from easily repositioning to control key squares. This move establishes a strong knight outpost on b3, creating immediate pressure on white's queenside and challenging the a5 pawn's advance. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, preparing to contest the open file and potentially create pressure on black's central pawns or the d8 square. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it controls important diagonals and prepares to potentially exchange itself for white's knight if white plays d5, creating a more open game. White eliminates black's well-placed bishop on a7, which was controlling the a7-1 diagonal and supporting the knight on c5. This move recaptures the bishop, challenging black's knight on c5 and aiming to simplify the position while potentially opening the a file for white's rook. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to create threats against black's kingside pawns and potentially support an advance on the kingside. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, likely aiming to convert an advantage in space and piece activity in the endgame. This pawn capture creates an unbalanced pawn structure on the kingside, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and bishops while weakening black's king safety. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing the kingside or preparing for a future queenside expansion. This move reinforces the e4 square and prepares to expand on the kingside. But it also slightly weakens the dark squares around your king, so be mindful of counterplay on that wing. The move 27, nb3 aims to exploit the open c-file and challenge white's control by offering a knight exchange which, if accepted, would lead to a more favorable pawn structure for black. This move opens the e-file for white's rook and allows the queen to potentially redeploy to a more active square, while also challenging black's knight on b3. The king bravely steps into the fray, aiming to centralize and support the d7 pawn while preparing to potentially activate the rook on f8. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to join the fight in the upcoming middle game by supporting pawns and potentially engaging. In kingside play, the king ventures into the center, aiming to participate in the endgame by activating its defensive and offensive potential, while also preparing to support potential pawn advances. The king's central advance with k3 is a necessary step to activate the monarch in the endgame, aiming to control key squares and support potential pawn advances while preparing for the challenges of the open position. The knight's advance to h5 aims to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king, potentially eyeing the f4 square and creating tactical opportunities. The move 31, kf2 is a prudent repositioning of the king, seeking to centralize it and connect the rooks more effectively while also preparing for potential kingside activity and defensive reinforcement. The move nf6 aims to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting squares like e4 or d5, and to offer a pawn break with the f-pawn if white attempts to advance it further. This rook exchange simplifies the position and opens the d-file for white's remaining rook, aiming to exploit the somewhat passive placement of black's knight on f6. The exchange of rooks on the d-file opens up the d-file for black's remaining rook, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside or pressure along the open file. The bishop repositions to the active d1 square, potentially preparing to swing to the g4 diagonal to harass the black king or to support a d4-d5 pawn advance in the future. Black's knight repositions to d2, eyeing the weak d3 pawn and potentially supporting a future c4 pawn advance to contest the center. This move forces the black king to move and aims to exploit the open lines created by the pawn exchange, potentially leading to material advantage or a decisive attack on the weakened black king. This capture, while seemingly forcing, allows white to establish a strong central pawn presence and potential queenside majority after recapturing with the pawn. This move exploits black's misplaced knight on d2, winning material and simplifying into a favorable endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside will prove decisive. This pawn exchange simplifies the position, but it's important to be aware of the resulting open d-file and the activity your opponent's knight might gain. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can support the pawn push and potentially reroute to c3 for defense or to a more advanced attacking post. Black recaptures the pawn, creating doubled pawns for white on the H file and opening the E file for potential activity, which may be strategically advantageous despite the pawn deficit. This move recaptures the pawn, solidifying white's material advantage and activating the bishop to control key central squares. This exchange removes black's crucial bishop on f3, simplifying the position and allowing white to advance their passed pawn structure on the kingside. The pawn chain on the kingside has been broken, creating doubled f-pawns which can potentially be weaknesses, but also opening the g-file for your rook and improving bishop mobility. Black activates the rook to challenge the open d-file and prepare to contest white's remaining central pawn majority. The move 39, rc1 aims to centralize the rook, activate it on the semi-open c-file, and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside, while also creating defensive possibilities against black's advanced knights. The rook advances to the 5th rank, contesting the open c-file and preparing to create potential queenside weaknesses by targeting the b3 pawn. This rook move prepares to contest the crucial c-file, aiming to improve white's rook activity and potentially create threats on the queenside or centralize the rook after further exchanges. The black king now centralizes, aiming to support the knight on b3 and potentially participate in endgame action, while white solidifies their position with rook development. The knight returns to c3 to reinforce the pawn on d4 and prepare to potentially redeploy to the d4 square or support the eventual advance of the e-pawn. This move recaptures the pawn on a5, aiming to simplify the position and potentially activate the rook by bringing it to the open file. White uses the rook check to force the black king to move, aiming to regain the pawn on a5 after the rook capture. The king must retreat to safety on e7 to avoid capture by the rook after the pawn recapture, and to prepare for potential future pawn advances by white. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside by advancing the g-pawn, which could become a significant asset in the endgame, although it also weakens the kingside pawn structure. The rook now eyes the queenside pawns, aiming to create weaknesses or potentially support a passed pawn advance. The king is brought into the game to support the advance of the kingside pawns and potentially create a passed pawn, a crucial plan in simplified endgames. This move prepares to defend the kingside pawns, specifically the g-pawn, which could become vulnerable if white pushes the h-pawn. The white king moves to the center to become more active and support potential pawn pushes, aiming to improve its position in the endgame. The rook moves to the c6 square to defend the b3 pawn and potentially prepare for future rook activity along the 6th rank or support a pawn advance. The move rg2 aims to consolidate white's advantage in the rook endgame by preparing to activate the g-file for potential pawn advances and defending the kingside while the rooks are still on the board. This check forces the white king to a less active square, allowing black to potentially regroup and improve the position of the rook on the d-file. This move, k5, repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the advancing pawns and potentially attack black's weak pawn structure. This knight check is a forcing move that aims to disrupt white's king position and potentially disrupt their pawn structure. The king actively seeks centralizing influence and support for its advancing pawns, aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside while improving its defensive coverage of the kingside majority. The knight repositions to c5, preparing to either attack the exposed white king or support a pawn advance on the queenside, creating dynamic counterplay. This checking move aims to dislodge black's knight from the strong c5 square, forcing it to retreat and potentially opening lines for white's rook to become more active. The king seeks a more active central role, aiming to support the advanced passed pawn and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. This move reroutes the king to a safer square on g3, preparing to support the advance of the h-pawn and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. White's king is exposed on the open g-file, and this move prepares to further attack it by clearing potential defenders and creating threats against the king. This move activates the rook to the central open file, preparing to challenge black's advanced knight and potentially create threats against the black king. This move reactivates the knight, aiming to create counterplay by potentially attacking the weakened pawn structure on white's kingside, specifically targeting g4. This knight maneuver aims to reroute to a more active square, potentially targeting the weakened kingside pawns or supporting a central advance while increasing pressure on the black knight. The king bravely ventures forward to centralize and support the knight's potential advance while actively contesting the open file, aiming to disrupt white's kingside majority and create counterplay. This move activates the rook to a more central position, aiming to attack black's potentially weak knight on c5 and also to improve its scope along the fourth rank. This move, 53, f6, is a defensive reaction to the strong pressure white's rook and knight exert on black's position, aiming to create some breathing room by challenging the knight and potentially opening lines for the king. This move capitalizes on the pinned knight and opens a path for the rook to potentially disrupt black's pawn structure or attack the king. nd4 is a good move, centralizing the knight and attacking white's f3 pawn, creating a tactical threat that white must address. The knight's aggressive sortie to h5 targets the weak pawn on f6 and simultaneously prepares to challenge black's dominant knight on circa 5, aiming to simplify and improve white's piece activity. This move forces the exchange of knights, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's somewhat exposed king and potentially weak kingside pawn structure in the ensuing endgame. This pawn capture solidifies white's queenside structure and creates a passed pawn, though it also opens the g-file for black's rook activity. The rook must return to the 7th rank to prevent white's knight from infiltrating further and to support the pawn structure against further advances. The king's active repositioning to g4 aims to support the pawn push on the kingside and potentially create new attacking chances, though it must remain vigilant against counterplay from black's rook. This move aims to activate the rook to a central file, aiming to support potential pawn advances or pressure white's position after white's king is exposed.